Well, thanks you everybody for joining us. Tonight we have a special guest. We have Kaitlyn Davis. She's new to Arizona. She's a new um, associate professor at NAU. Is that correct?
Assistant professor, but hopefully in 6 years they'll give me tenure and I'll be associate.
Okay, well, why don't I just go ahead and turn it over to you and you can introduce yourself. And then when you're ready, you can start your PowerPoint and we'll go from there.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Richard. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Sorry that I couldn't be there in person. It's new faculty orientation week. So we just wrapped up meetings about 45 minutes ago, and my 30-year-old truck doesn't go that fast to get down to be with you all in person. So thanks for putting up with Zoom. And like Richard said, my name's Kaitlyn Davis. I'm a new faculty member at Northern Arizona University in the Southwest Archaeology program. I have done most of my previous work in Colorado and New Mexico as far as Southwest archaeology goes, but also some in Utah. My last work in Arizona was in 2012, so I'm looking forward to learning from you all about what's going on in Arizona archaeology these days. I've worked for the Forest Service previously. I've worked for Montana State Parks. I've worked for CRM, and I'm enjoying getting back into an educational space. So that's what I've been up to and what I'll be sharing with you today. I'll go ahead and share the screen. Is going to be my dissertation work. Richard, can you confirm that the slides are up okay?
Yes, it's coming in great.
Okay, great. So yeah, what I'll be talking with you about today is a community-driven and collaborative project that I worked on in New Mexico for several years with several different stakeholders who are wonderful people, and some of them have turned into good friends. So it was a collaborative project with the New Mexico State Land Office, with the U.S. Forest Service on the Santa Fe National Forest, and with the Archaeological Conservancy, and with the Pueblo Powake, and with students and helpers from multiple universities in New Mexico, Colorado, and some folks even drove down from Notre Dame to help out. So what this project was focused on is trying to better understand the agricultural systems that Tewa Pueblo people were employing in their communities in the northern Rio Grande, and how those agricultural systems changed with the onset of Spanish colonization. And what we have in this picture here is, you can see our pin flag here in the front. This is a gravel mulch field, and we'll go into what those are a little bit more in the talk. But on the right of the screen is the interior of the gravel mulch field. On the left side is the exterior of it. And what we'll be focusing on is these cobble borders that you can see kind of running up the middle of the slide, and then that denser space of gravels on the right-hand side. So as we're moving through the slides, see how many gravel mulch fields you can spot. Hopefully it'll let me advance the slides. There we go. Okay, so diving a bit more into where are we in space and why are we looking at this space? So the map that you see on the left is the areas basically surrounding Albuquerque, and this is looking at the Tewa heartland here. So Tewa is one of the Tanoan language groups. For those of you who've been to Hopi, there is a Tewa village at Hopi, and Hopi and Tewa have historical connections in terms of helping each other and family connections. But Tewa is a different language community, and most of the Tewa Pueblos are basically between Albuquerque and Taos. There are other Tanoan related languages in there too. And so what you see in that black bounding box on the map is the area over which we employed our environmental reconstruction model. So in a little bit, I'll talk about all the different lines of evidence that we tried to bring together to try to better understand this agricultural system. And one of them was doing environmental modeling, trying to do temperature and precipitation reconstructions. So that black box is where we did those reconstructions. So if you have a community or an area or a site that you're interested in that falls within that box and you need climate data, feel free to email me, and I'll put my email in the chat at the end, and Richard can share it too. And I'm happy to get you that precipitation and temperature data for your area of interest. The purple dots that you see there are the ancestral Pueblo communities or archaeological sites that are known within that area. And you can see that there is a clustering of them down the middle line. Does anyone know what that cluster aligns with? Yeah, I think I heard someone say a river. So yeah, the Rio Grande and other rivers are where that long line in the middle is clustering. And so the four villages that we're going to be talking mostly about today are Poshuwinge, Cuyamungue, San Marcos, and Pueblo Blanco. And in a little bit, we'll go into why we're focusing on those four communities. But those are the communities where we actually did on the ground field work. We surveyed the agricultural catchments surrounding the villages. We looked at artifact data to try to understand when these different fields were in use. We cored the fields, taking soil cores to look at pollen to see what was grown in the different fields at different times. And so we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And the reason why I have the cotton picture up here is one of the things that got this project going is trying to figure out, we did this environmental reconstruction, and based on temperature and water for New Mexico, cotton environmentally couldn't have been supported there at the time that we know Pueblo people were growing cotton, based on the evidence of weaving looms that we see in the archaeological record, based on the pollen record. And so how were they getting cotton to grow there? And so that's something that we were interested in. So then moving on to a little bit more of the background for the project. So in addition to being interested in how the agricultural systems in this area were operating and how that knowledge can be of use for Tewa communities today, we also were interested in trying to better understand how the agricultural system changed with Spanish colonization. So we know that the pre-contact Pueblo agricultural system, depicted from one of the Poshuwinge fields on the left, was mostly dryland farming, as well as some check dams. So they were funneling water resources, but it was a lot of times focused on these ridgetop gravel mulch field areas or dryland field areas. And so most of the focus being on maize and accompanying crops that help support the community. And so we go from that to Spanish agricultural and culinary introductions, represented by a dough bowl in that middle top photo and a soup plate in the lower middle. Those are two new forms of pottery that we see show up in the area with Spanish colonization, but we do see them made with Tewa clay recipes and in these Tewa villages, and so in Tewa homes. And so we do see that there was some incorporation into the community of the Spanish introductions of wheat and soup and things like that. And then, as we know today, that's a picture from a feast day home table spread from a couple years ago. We have bread, we have fry bread, we have all these things that are introduced crops. So how do we get from no introductions to now it being commonplace at a Pueblo feast day? And we were trying to better understand how quickly those introductions got adopted into Pueblo communities and to what extent. And I should preface all of this with the fact that we are not saying in this work that wheat was more important than maize. Like, maize was still the crop of extreme cultural importance for the community. But we do see that the introductions were being brought into the community with some agency from the community. We were seeing more evidence of these introductions than would just have been required by the Spanish in the ethnohistoric documents for, for taxation purposes or anything like that. So we're trying to understand how this system was all working out. So some more lines of evidence that show that the Pueblo communities were actually incorporating some of these Spanish agricultural introductions into their own system and into their own communities, rather than just, keeping it at arm's length because it was a Spanish thing, would be linguistic evidence. So for those of you who maybe were foreign language teachers or have been teaching languages, you know that there are loan words and then there are indigenous words. So if an introduced concept comes into a community, either that community will borrow or kind of adapt whatever the foreign community was calling that term. And that kind of shows that they're still keeping it kind of as a foreign idea, is what some linguistic anthropologists would say. But if an introduction comes in and the community makes a word for it in their own language, that suggests, according to linguistic anthropologists, that the community actually is seeing that introduction as being part of their own culture at this point. Now, like, they're bringing it into their culture. It's not just a foreign thing that they're kind of keeping at arm's length. So an example, bread oven. There is a Tewa word for a bread oven. They don't just refer to it as an orno. I believe bute is the Tewa word for bread oven. It basically means bread house is what it translates to. And then there also are songs used in Tewa ceremonies today that talk about, spirit beings and important beings coming and helping both the corn and the wheat grow. So we do see this incorporation of wheat into the culture. Also, ceramic evidence. One could think that if the community wanted nothing to do with things that came from Spanish agriculture, that during the post-revolt period, when the Spanish were pushed back towards El Paso, that we would see a stoppage in using any of these soup plates, dough bowls, things that would be used for preparing Spanish cuisine. But we don't see that. We actually see it ramping up. So what this slide on the left shows is pitting. So for those of you who make bread at home, and I know a lot of folks were doing that during COVID, if you're kneading your own dough and you have your big mixing bowl, you're kind of swiping it around the edge of the bowl a little bit. And we see that in these dough bowls. There are these thicker vessels of a particular composition that show up in New Mexico at this time in Tewa communities. And we see that pitting from kind of pushing the dough around in that pattern. And we see more of that use-ware in these vessels showing up in that post-revolt period. And then the soup plates, we see also more of those showing up as well. So that's some of the evidence of why we're starting to ask these questions. So then the questions, which I know I've been alluding to several times over now, is how did Pueblo agriculture and land use change through time? The time period we specifically were focusing on was 1400s to 1600s. And how was Pueblo agriculture impacted by initial Spanish colonization? So from the 1530s, when the Spanish arrived in the sites that we're focusing on for this talk, up until the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And that long sentence in the tiny font at the bottom just mainly alludes to the fact that part of what I think makes this work hopefully useful for folks is that the number of methods and the number of communities and agencies and stakeholders that were involved in bringing this project together. Because as we go through our conversation this evening, you'll probably walk away at the end being like, Kaitlyn, you told us nothing new. Like, yeah, I probably didn't. You probably know what is already here today, but it more was just that we brought in all these different lines of evidence to say those things. And so it's using these methods together and using them in a way that the community was in favor of. So we didn't do any excavation for this project. We did do some soil coring, but we didn't do any excavation. And that was at the request of the federal agencies and of the tribes. And so something that's exciting about these methods and about the way the work was done is that it opens up a lot more areas to doing archaeology in terms of actual sites. Because most of these, or at least a few of the sites that we're going to be working at or talking about this evening, don't allow excavation or wouldn't allow archaeological work unless it's minimally invasive. So we can use these methods to access and understand other sites and other places that previously have been closed off to archaeology. So then I know I'm jumping ahead. So for anyone who needs to head home early, here's what we learned. So you can go home and not have to listen to the next 40 slides that says how we got here. But I figured at least let you know where we're going. So what we learned from all this, and then I'll talk about how we learned it, is that we saw differential agricultural productivity. So we did see in the pollen and the phytolith data and in the archaeological survey data, the number of field features, the size of the agricultural fields, we do see more agricultural productivity at some villages than others. What's interesting is that it doesn't necessarily correlate with environment. And it doesn't necessarily correlate with village population either. Like there were villages that were smaller than others that were producing more agricultural products than some of those bigger villages. And so this could lead to an argument that perhaps agricultural products were traded because, for example, we'll talk about Cuyamungue. Cuyamungue is not known for its pottery production the way that a San Marcos is with all of its glazeware or the Galisteo Basin sites. So what did Cuyamungue have to offer to the interregional trade system? That's something that folks have wondered about. And that's a village that was producing more than double, at least based on our evidence, agricultural products of some of the other villages, despite not being the biggest of the villages. And so maybe that was what it was contributing to the system. And so that's something we can think about. We do see a differential adoption of livestock versus crops. So in our data, which we're going to go into together in a second, we do see more archaeological evidence of livestock being incorporated into the Tewa communities at this time, more so than Spanish introduced crops. It seems like wheat was a lot slower to get going in the communities than livestock was. And there could be several reasons for this. One could be that livestock was doing something new for the community, whereas wheat wasn't really doing anything that corn wasn't already doing for the community. And wheat didn't grow better in New Mexico than maize did, whereas livestock were more prolific than cotton was, if we're thinking about cotton versus wool for clothing. So those are some things we can start thinking about. And then the other takeaway that we had from this project is the continued utility of agricultural technologies. So one of the last methods we'll talk about in this presentation is the gravel mulch field remote sensing tests that were done to see how those fields are still functioning today. And they're still functioning well. And we actually see twice the plant density in these archaeological fields, despite them not having been tended for several centuries now, more so than the areas outside of those fields. So we do see a continued utility and functioning of these technologies, which is something that the community members that I've been working with were really interested in. So the next several slides are going to talk about how we arrived at these three takeaways and what's the data behind what we're saying here. But before we do that, since I know that the group that we've convened here today, everybody is mostly come in Arizona. There might be some folks on Zoom who are elsewhere, but I'll go into a little bit of a history of the 4 sites that we're talking about in case you haven't gotten to visit them in New Mexico yet. So our 4 sites are Pochuwingue, Pueblo Blanco, San Marcos, and Cuyamungue. And the reason why these 4 sites were picked is that we had 2 kind of subregions. So Poshuwenge and Cuyamungue, which you can see on the map, are in the Española Basin and in the Chama area. And so that's kind of one micro environmental area. And then we have San Marcos and Pueblo Blanco down in the Galisteo Basin. So we have these two subregions that we're comparing. And then within each of those subregions, we have one pre-contact site and one site that was occupied into the time of Spanish contact. So Poshuwenge and Pueblo Blanco, the villages were no longer actively inhabited prior to the Spanish getting there. So the movement out of those villages didn't have to do with Spanish impact or Spanish driving people out. The San Marcos and Cuyamungue were occupied into Spanish contact for several years, and they were impacted heavily by the Pueblo revolt and the way that the Spanish were, forcing Pueblo people to have to adjust their way of living. Cuyamungue did not have a mission church. It was a visita of non-Bay, so the priest would come and administer communion, but they had no actual mission complex at Cuyamungue. San Marcos did have a mission complex on site. And so that's another difference that we were interested is, do the sites that actually have a mission in them show more evidence of Spanish agricultural products than the sites that did not? So these are some of the things that we're thinking about. And Poshuwenge, I apologize that the map on the left is so dark. What that target looking radial plot is showing the different half-kilometer increments of an agricultural catchment. So previous researchers on agriculture on communities of this size have said that about 2 kilometers out from a village is where the intensive agriculture extends to. You could have scattered fields and hunting locations and gathering locations beyond that, but that's where the bulk of the agriculture is happening. So that's the area that we focused our survey on. And we also focused on 3 different microenvironments within that agricultural catchment. We looked at the floodplain, we looked at these ridge tops, and we looked at the elevation or the plane on which the village itself was sitting. So you can see the views from Poshuwenge, and you can see some of the features that we were seeing. And they are hard to see from photos. Photos don't do them justice, but when you are doing pedestrian survey, you can pick up these alignments pretty well. We did record 69 agricultural features during our survey of Poshuwenge and covered about 75 acres. And I will say that the limitations on where we were able to survey and what we were able to cover were mostly due to land management and permissions. So for Poshuwenge, it is managed by the Forest Service currently, but it is surrounded by private land. And so we were able to access Forest Service portions, and we were accessing Forest Service portions that the Forest Service said needed additional survey work done. There are other portions of the site that have already been intensively surveyed and worked on. And we weren't looking within the village itself. We were looking at the agricultural area around the village. So then a little bit about Poshuwenge. It's one of the largest ancestral Tewa sites with no evidence of Spanish occupation or influence. It was occupied during the early part of the Classic period, as evidenced by Biscuit A and Biscuit B ceramics found at the site, as well as tree ring dates that extend from about 1350 to 1525. Jensen, who did work there in the early 1900s in the village itself, noted that there were no Spanish or Spanish-era artifacts found during his excavations. Thus, since it is a pre-contact village, it's a good comparison to the historic Tewa site of Cuyamungue from the perspective of Spanish impact on agricultural practice in the Pueblos. It's located about close to the Chama River and the Rio Grande. It's about 22.5 miles above where those two rivers meet. And it's just to the south of the Chama and just southeast of Abiquiu. The village was fairly sizable, and about 2,000 rooms is what it's been calculated to be. Squash, pumpkin, and gourd seeds were found. Poshuwenge, the Tewa term does translate into the squash village or the squash place. And we do see evidence of meat consumption, and that the ceramic evidence that we see suggests that it was an interaction point for the Rio Grande Pueblos. We do see ceramics coming in from the surrounding Rio Grande Pueblos. And that's a little bit about Poshawenge. So then moving on to talking a little bit about Pueblo Blanco. So we surveyed this big strip in here because that coincides with the New Mexico State Land Office boundary, and it is also surrounded by private land. So we weren't able to actually move as far out in the catchment as in the other sites, but we still at least can talk about some of these radial distances. So at Pueblo Blanco, we found 40 agricultural features. And by agricultural features, I mean check dams, fields, field houses. That's what we're considering to be agricultural features. And we did find, there's an example of a metate that we found, and we did find some really expertly designed glazewares, since we are in the Galisteo Basin, which is really known for its glazeware production. And you can see an example of a check dam here in the photo. So a little bit about Pueblo Blanco. It is one of the few accessible pre-contact sites in the Galisteo Basin. Most of the other ones have some Spanish contact or are in places that we couldn't get people and vehicles into them. So it is a useful comparison to the Spanish era sites in the Galisteo. The diagnostic ceramics date the bulk of the occupation to about 1300 to 1490, with periodic use a little bit after that. The village had around 16 roux blocks and 5 kivas, 7 plazas, as well as several reservoirs. So one thing that's interesting about Pueblo Blanco is they had to do a lot of water control here because it's not close to a river the way that the other sites are. And the archaeological survey work that was done within the village itself was in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And they did document several check dams and other features. And then we, like I said, we're looking at the agricultural space beyond the footprint of the village itself. And today the site is managed by the New Mexico State Land Office. So Cuyamungue, we were able to look at kind of the area moving northwest from the village. And you can see here, the reason why I have a more detailed map to share about this site is because the University of Colorado, prior to this work that we're talking about today, prior to this project, we did a intensive mapping of the village itself. And one thing that's actually really cool, just to kind of go on a side tangent about how neat remote sensing data can be, is that the room block outlines that you see here, we traced those from drone footage. So we flew drone aerial photography over the site in 2014. And then the time of year that we flew it, there's a particular type of plant that really thrives in melted adobe. And so these plants at this time of year were super tall, and we were able to filter and use the photogrammetry from the drones to stitch an orthophoto, is what it's called. And we were able to actually see the outlines of the rooms from these plants, and we're able to trace those and map them and get a pretty detailed understanding of this village itself. And then the outside of the house mounds.
I did want to ask a question. Your picture is quite small. Is that a block wall back there in the picture? Up a little bit.
Picture, the photo?
Yes.
Yeah, so that is one of our best preserved gravel mulch fields. So the gravel mulch field, so that's not one of the room blocks. That's one of the agricultural fields. And the main thing to pay attention to in that photo is this is one of our best examples of how these fields are still functioning. So if you look into the interior of the field, which is the upper part of the photo, inside that cobble border wall, you can see just the density of plants relative to the foreground of the photo, which is outside of the gravel mulch field. So it just shows, that these fields are still functioning today. But that was one of our best preserved fields that we found. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I believe it did.
Okay. Great. So then we found 33 agricultural features at Kuymunge, but they were more sizable than the ones at the other sites. So San Marcos, we were again focusing on the agricultural catchment surrounding the village because the village itself had already been examined by several archaeological expeditions, including Nels Nelson in the early 1900s. So San Marcos did have some eroded farming terraces, which the photo in the upper middle shows. You can see the cobbles that have kind of gotten spread out. And then we do see a gravel mulch field here. We see the cobble outline. And like I said, the pictures don't really do them justice. They do stand out more on the landscape. And the reason why we were focusing on San Marcos is because it was a significant Spanish era Tewa site and also Carisan in the Galisteo Basin and had a mission complex and is really known for its gravel mulch fields. There was work done in the 1990s on the gravel mulch fields that the professors and the researchers had to stop their work before they got to finish writing a lot of it up. So then data sets. So now that we've talked about the communities themselves, what were we looking at to get our results? So we dived into the archival and ethnohistoric literature to see what the Spanish were saying was being grown in these communities. We looked at paleo-environmental modeling, climate data encoding, and I know that these maps on this slide are small. The main point that they're showing is that in this upper right, maize, the darker the green is, the more years that there was enough water and enough temperature growing degree days to actually grow the crop. So maize in our agricultural catchment here could grow pretty much every year. Wheat could grow a little over half the time, and cotton couldn't grow at all. The environmental conditions did not meet the needs for cotton. But the gravel mulch areas, which we can see mapped down in this lower figure on the left, combined with the irrigable areas along the river corridors, do line up with where we actually see cotton being grown from the pollen data. So that led us to believe that a lot of the agricultural infrastructure that the Pueblos were investing in was to help get cotton to grow, because environmentally it couldn't grow on its own. And the data sets that are in red are the ones we're going to talk about in more detail today. So we'll talk about the results of the field survey. We'll talk about the results of the soil coring for the pollen and phytoliths. We'll talk about the results of the remote sensing and what we learned from collaboration. So I know this slide is super wordy. It's just to basically show the list of agricultural features that we found. So we found fields with rocks. Some were cobble bordered, some had gravel mulch, some had combination. We can see a gravel mulch field here in the lower right that had a cobble border. We can see the corner of it where the pin flag is. Again, note that we have denser vegetation within the field than we have outside of the field. Inside the field is upper part of the photo. Outside of the field is the bottom of the photo. We did find borrow pits. So the borrow pits you see in the upper right photo, what those are is areas that were excavated from the gravels and from soil so they could remulch the field. So if you come upon a field, you'll see a whole bunch of these barrow pits or borrow pits ringing the field because they were using that to kind of replenish the field. And then we see irrigation ditches, we see check dams, which we've already talked about. We see directional markers. Those would be rocks pointing towards cardinal directions or significant surrounding mountains and landscape features. We see field houses. We see hearths and roasting pits. So those were the types of agricultural features that we found. We did also find datable artifacts. We found, glazewares that got repurposed as digging tools, for example, like this bowl shirt here. So those are what we were finding during our pedestrian surveys. For our soil coring, you can see an example of a few of our cores in the upper right. We were taking soil cores about 2 feet deep And we couldn't go any deeper than that because we would hit the utility lines. So we got told by the communities we were working with, if you hit our power lines or our buried utility lines, you can't work here anymore. So we went about that deep. But previous work in this area from people who've looked at pollen and phytoliths and other soils studies have said that the planting layer from the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s is only about 10 to 20 centimeters down in this particular landscape. So we were feeling good about hitting that layer with our core. And so what the picture in the bottom right shows is the lab at the University of Texas, where we were doing the phytolith extractions. And what that particular photo is showing is getting the clays in the soil to separate out from the phytoliths and the organic material. And then that photo in the middle with all of the interesting geometric shapes is what phytoliths look like under the microscope. So I imagine most folks are probably familiar with pollen. Phytoliths are basically the silica bits of plants that are left behind when the plant decomposes. So the phytoliths, what's interesting about them is not only can they tell us about maybe the type of plant they came from. For example, maize has some really distinctive phytoliths, but they also can tell us what part of the plant they came from, like if it came from a husk or from a leaf. And they also can tell us how the environmental conditions were doing. If it was a really wet growing season, they'll have thicker silica cell walls than they would otherwise. And so we can learn a lot about not only what plants were growing, but what harvesting practices were. Like if we see a bunch of husks or husk phytoliths in a spot, maybe that's where things were getting harvested and processed, for example. So we can learn a lot about how the processing was happening as well as what was being planted. And then we did do some soil chemistry to look at the planting layers and find out how much soil turnover there had been. And then we also did dendrochronology for older trees that were growing in the fields to see when those fields fell out of use and trees started to grow up in them. And then throughout all these methods, we also were focused on community collaboration. So we did have Poake community members and interns from their environment department helping us in our survey. So a lot of these features that were identified by community members themselves who were part of the archaeological team and advising and guiding the methods of this work. We also had San Marcos, its agricultural catchment is now under an HOA subdivision. And so the landowners were all incredibly supportive and all joined in the archaeological team to help get these sites documented. And now there's work towards trying to get a historic district nomination for that area. And then in the lower right, you can see the director of the Poake Environment Department and one of his students collecting soil samples. So it wasn't just communities being consulted, the communities were actually doing the work too, which I think led to our results being a lot more robust and more useful to the community than if it had just been an outside effort. So then I'm gonna skip ahead because I know we're already halfway through our time. I'm gonna skip through the tables because the tables I don't think are gonna display very well, and I'll talk about what the main points were. So the main points from the feature size, which stands to reason, is that we do have smaller fields in the Spanish period than in the pre-Spanish period. So that's the main finding when we looked at field size. And the main finding when we looked at feature type across the sites was that we have more shrines in the pre-contact period, which would make sense if we think about Spanish impacts on religious practice, because there were in-field shrines pre-Spanish contact. And then we also see more check dams and more water control features pre-Spanish contact, which also makes sense because the Spanish emphasizing irrigation ditches rather than check dams and dryland farming. We do see, in terms of sites, the post-contact sites, Cuyumungue and San Marcos, had a lot more barrow pits than Poxuwingue and Pueblo Blanco. And that makes sense because those fields were used longer, those villages were occupied longer, so they have to replenish the nutrients in those fields and the soils in those fields more often. So none of the results in terms of what type of agricultural features we were seeing over time and over space were particularly surprising. And then feature type by time period, we do see a decline in the shrines, like we talked about, and a decline in the water control features. By distance, how is farming changing the further you get away from the village? The main thing is that, which again is makes sense, is that we have more agricultural features closer to the village because, you know, nobody wants to walk further than they have to. The one thing that we do see turn up a little further away is the field houses, which makes sense because you might not be able to run back and forth as easily to the further away fields. So you need that field house space. So those all make sense. Feature position. One new thing that we did learn is that all of the fields were on a 4 to 6 degree slope on average, and that they were mostly oriented east or southwest to capture either early day or late day sun. So we did see a pretty consistent pattern to how these fields were actually being built on the landscape and how the intentionality behind that. The catchment extent we talked about, it does go, you know, a little bit beyond 2 kilometers is what we found. So, but the more intensive activity is happening closer to the village. Artifacts by site. So the main takeaways from here are that we do see more chipstone at our pre-contact sites, which are in blue and gray. But we do see also a lot of bowls and jars in the field, suggesting reuse of them as tools. So like we said, none of the survey results were really all that surprising. But we were able to reinforce through this artifact data some things that had kind of been talked about in the literature but hadn't been quantified. So that was helpful. One thing that was interesting is that the chipstone was higher in the gravel mulch fields, and that does make sense in the context of potentially like garden hunting in those fields. And we also do see more chipstone the further you get away from the center of the village, which also makes sense in terms of trying to hunt more of the animals that are outside of the village area. And this is just another artifact plot looking at other features beyond the fields themselves. So artifact type by time period, we do see a decrease in bowls into the Spanish contact period in the field, and we see an increase in jars. And so whether that has to do with transport of materials, that's something that we're still thinking through, and I would love to hear people's thoughts on that. The artifact density, like we talked about, besides chipstone, everything else goes down the further you get from the village, but chipstone density goes up the further you get from the village. And we already talked about the density of artifacts by distance, that basically throughout all the sites, again, more closer to the village. So I know those were a lot of not particularly astounding graphs, but the main takeaways from those are that we see more check dams at pre-colonial sites versus potentially more floodplain use at the contact era sites. We see more barrow pits at the contact area sites, which we talked about, replenishing these longer used fields. We see more stone tools and evidence of tool manufacture in general at the pre-Spanish sites. And we see larger agricultural areas in use overall at the sites occupied into the Spanish contact era. We also see more agricultural diversity and productivity at the contact era sites. And maybe that helped contribute to why those sites were occupied longer, or maybe it had to do with the fact that they now had to feed more people because they did have a Spanish taxation requirement. There are several hypotheses we could think through there. The main points, which are in red, is that we did see that evidence of some villages being more agriculturally focused, having more fields, having bigger fields, even if they weren't the biggest villages population-wise. So that's the survey. So I think that was probably the least interesting of the results. So hopefully the presentation gets more interesting from here. So getting into the coring, you can see different folks coring. We have team members from Puake on the left. We have landowners from San Marcos in the middle, and we have students from the community colleges and universities on the lower right. And then the upper right photo is what the cores look like when they come out of the core. So in the core itself is a plastic sleeve. And then when we pull the core out, the sediment is within the core in that sleeve, and then we cap it. And that's really important since we are interested in change over time. So we need to preserve that stratigraphy to be able to look at the older planting layers on the bottom versus the colonial planting layers on the top. So then how did we analyze the cores? Once we pulled the core out of the ground, how did we figure out where the planting layers were? So we used PXRF. So you can see the XRF, which is X-ray fluorescence machine here on the left. And we would cut this plastic core. We would cut it in half just with a Dremel or a pipe cutter. And then we would run it on this little conveyor belt here. So we'd move the XRF machine on this automatic arm down the core, and it would take readings at every 3 millimeters along the core. And what we were looking for were changes in argon, changes in potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, changes in aluminum, and changes in the iron ratio. And what those can tell us, if we see those peaks and dips line up, is that either that soil was getting turned over, that soil was getting planted in. That's how we can figure out where the planting layers were. And once we figure out where the planting layers are, then we can get charcoal from those layers to date the layers. We can pull the phytolith and the pollen from those layers. That's how we knew where within the core to actually take our samples. So we did do pollen analyses. We looked at 46 samples of cores for pollen. And over here on the left, you can see what a maize pollen looks like. And then our results, I know this graph looks really messy, but I mainly just put it up there to show you what a pollen output looks like. So when, if you were looking at an environmental report, this is what a pollen output would look like. And the main things to pay attention to are that Kuimunge had the least dense concentration of pollen in its cores. But despite having less pollen overall in the core, it had twice the cotton pollen, Gossypium pollen, and twice the Zea pollen density, Zea is maize, than the next highest villages. So again, we see a village that has less pollen overall, but more of it is crops. And so this is a more agriculturally intensive village. And overall, we see more maize coming out of the northern area, Poshawenge and Kuimunge, than the Galisteo, at least in the pollen record. And we see more cotton in the sites that were occupied for longer. So then, I know this slide is wordy. This was just mainly to kind of talk through some things that we could start thinking about from the pollen. So we do see ubiquity of maize pollen. We see it throughout all the samples. We also see a lot of native and wild cultigens showing up in the pollen record amongst the maize. So that was a neat finding for us, is that we could see these encouraged non-domesticated plants growing contemporaneously with the domesticated crops, things like bee weed, which was used in paint, and things like yucca, things that could have been used as in other ways. So there was a care and an encouragement of these wild plants among and around the domesticated crops. We do also see sporomyia. Sporomyia is evidence of animal manure. And so what we see is that we also see domesticated animals showing up, and that's how we were starting to think about the uptake of livestock. As far as wheat, did we see any wheat pollen? We had a couple maybes. So we had a decent bit of evidence that livestock were showing up in the early years of colonization, but not so much that wheat was getting grown. So that was one of our main takeaways from back in the beginning of our talk. And then the bulk samples, again, showed more agricultural focus in some villages than others. Phytoliths, we already talked about how we process them, what they are. So here's another example of phytoliths under the microscope. And some of these aren't phytoliths. Some of these are just mineral bits that still were there in the process. But this is a phytolith in the middle here, these kind of purplish looking ones. And those were from likely from domesticate grasses. The one on the right anyway. The one on the left is probably a platelet from a woody plant. And so what we learned from the phytoliths was similar to what we learned from the pollen. We do see more domesticate, agricultural phytoliths showing up in the more agriculturally productive villages, which weren't necessarily the biggest villages. And so what we learned from that is that we see domesticated grasses, we see squash. As far as what's known is there aren't cotton phytoliths, but we did see a calcium oxalate, which is a byproduct from cotton that we think was showing up in the samples and warrants further research. And we do see increased abundance and diversity of planting at Cuyamungue. So kind of our theme here is that, again, more agricultural activity in some villages than others, not necessarily correlate with environment or population. And we also see more livestock being incorporated in the early years of colonization rather than crops like wheat. And we didn't see, I had a question in another presentation I gave on a similar topic where they said, well, did you look for any other Spanish crops? We didn't see any other Spanish crops show up in our botanical data at these sites. So the other finding that we've already alluded to a bit is that continued functioning of the gravel mulch fields. So when we were counting both plant diversity and plant density of plants growing on the landscape today, we saw that within the fields, the plants were about twice as dense as they were outside of the fields, but they were less diverse. So it's an inverse relationship. Within the fields, fewer plant types are growing, which makes sense because when you make a field, you try to design it to grow what you're trying to grow and keep out what you don't want to grow. And then plant density, we have more plants, less variety within the field. So it shows that agriculturally, these fields are still viable and are still functioning. So again, getting back to our takeaways, Pueblo agriculture, like we said, we see the differences among the village, more diversification of planting and more density of planting in agriculture at the sites occupied during the colonial era. And we also see more evidence of livestock than wheat in those early centuries of Spanish colonization. As we move into later centuries, that's the next project that I'm working on, is a site that was occupied in the 1700s and 1800s and seeing if these ratios change. And then we talked about the importance of the community involvement and the targeted coring. So then one little study that I was going to share with you if we have time, which I think we have 5 minutes, so I will talk about this one, is the remote sensing work. So this study followed all the other stuff that we talked about. And this came out of the fact that we were like, these gravel mulch fields keep coming up as an important topic, and Cuyamungue keeps coming up as a really agriculturally important site. So let's take a deeper dive into how that site agriculture is operating. So we already talked about the gravel mulch fields. So we see the infield vegetation increase in the upper left. We see the cobble border in that middle. We see outside of the gravels versus inside of the gravels in the photo. The guiding questions here, we're trying to better understand how the gravel mulch fields functioned by flying thermal and aerial imagery. And so the reasoning for flying that imagery was twofold. One was, can we see any fields that we missed on the ground? And two was, can we see a difference in the thermal signature of those fields supporting that increased temperature that cotton needed to grow? Do we see that, and is there a pattern to it? So again, here's a slightly better photo of those house mounds at Cuyamungue. Hopefully that is showing up better since it is in color on this slide. I'm showing the room outlines. And then we do see the agricultural catchment that we surveyed. This area in red is where we flew the drone. And then here's our team out on survey of the site. And what we found from our drones, we did RGB photogrammetry. So we flew a Skydio drone. These lines down here show our flight paths. We flew a Skydio drone to get aerial photography of the fields. And then we also flew aerial thermal infrared. And we did handheld thermal as well over particular field boundaries. And what we found with the RGB imagery is that the people who were doing that pedestrian survey did a really good job. We didn't find any new fields in the aerial imagery that they didn't already find in the pedestrian survey. And that is really a testament also to the knowledge of the local community members who were guiding that survey and telling the crew what to look for. One thing that is useful in this upper left image, the nape imagery, which is the imagery, this fuzzy imagery, is what's commonly available, like if you zoomed in on Google Earth or something. And then the imagery in the upper left of that cut photo is from our drone at the same height. So you can see just the drastic increase in resolution. So if you're interested in these sorts of studies of finding features on the landscape and documenting these agricultural changes in gravel density, changes in plant density, finding these cobble borders, this drone imagery is really the way to go. And it's also really accessible. Like we were working on training community members with this drone. It's a drone, the Skydio drone, which we used, is really cost efficient as far as a drone goes, and processes really nicely. So it's a very accessible drone for teams to learn on. And then what we learned from the feature analyses, we did slope rasters, we did flow rasters, seeing how the water was moving over the landscape. We did digital elevation models or digital surface models. And this really helped give us a better understanding of how these fields were functioning, how they were moving water, how the slope articulated with the sun and the solar radiation. So we were able to understand the functioning of these fields a lot better. Thermal, I know this is just a screenshot because we're still processing this data. But what we learned from our handheld thermal imagery is that the main period of thermal difference was in the evenings. So the gravels are holding the temperature into the evenings, which makes sense. But what's neat about that from an agricultural perspective is that it also lessens the likelihood that frost is going to form overnight, which means that increases the growing degree days, which lets the cotton be able to grow in this area. And then what we learned from our drone flight of the thermal imagery is that the handheld actually worked better than the drone thermal imagery because we just had more focused imagery and resolution. And the drone, it was struggling with the wind and with other factors. So then the utility of the multi-methods approach. Hopefully this presentation, I know it might have seemed a little scattered because we were talking about so many methods in so many places, but hopefully what it showed is just how doing pedestrian survey, doing soil science, doing microbotanical analyses, doing remote sensing and geospatial work, how all of those can come together to support each other and also add different emphases to the story. And also how through using all these methods, you can still get meaningful, statistically significant results without excavating. And thus it opens up a lot more areas to exploration and to learning about. So then, like I said, the takeaways from the remote sensing data were that we were able to detect fields with our aerial photography drone, and that corresponded with the pedestrian survey. We did learn more about how the gravel mulch fields were regulating temperature and how they were holding temperature into the evening to stave off frost, to increase growing degree days, to allow cotton to grow. And then we also see remote sensing applications for Tewa communities. So that gets to the community piece. To conclude here, as I asked community members that we were working with, throughout the process, like, is this useful for you? What is helpful from this? And they said that these were a few of the things that they said was worthwhile from this work. One was the potential interest in reviving agriculture. There are community members who are interested in trying to replant in some of the fields that we found to be still functioning and still productive. So trying to replant in those and help teach youth about the traditional farming practices and trying to have a more sustainable local agricultural effort within the community. Another one is access. So because of the resolution of the photographs that we produced from our drones, there were sites that we were able to show to elders and to people who can't physically walk out to them anymore. And they found that meaningful to be able to see those places and look at those places again. Monitoring. The environment department at Pueblo is thinking of using the drones to be able to monitor some of their sites that they can't access to make sure that they aren't being looted or eroded or harmed in some other way, because this landscape is still very checkerboarded. There are inholdings that there's Pueblo land that's you have to go through non-Pueblo land, and there can be disputes with that. And so being able to actually steward and see how those places are doing is important to the community. Landscape presentation. What I mean by that is we did produce, and I will grab a copy of it, a 3D model, which I know you can't see super well on the screen, but we have this little 3D model of the village of Cuyamungue, and we made a bigger version of it that the community is going to be having community members paint in traditional colors and styles, and then that'll be in the tribal museum. So it'll be a really tactile way for children and other people to be able to feel the outline of the sites and experience the sites. And then training, these methods that we use, we're also training for the community members to be able to also start being able to work on more of their own archaeological and environmental projects. So again, that's what I had to share. We talked about, hopefully through all of that, the takeaways that we talked about at the very beginning, hopefully they now make sense and you say, oh yeah, I saw the data that backs those up. And I just want to thank you all again for your time and hope that you learned a bit about how in those early centuries of Spanish colonization that the Pueblo communities really were persisting in their agricultural efforts with their crops. They were continuing their maize efforts more so than wheat. So the wheat uptake really didn't come until later. And we do see the adoption of livestock. And we do see that some villages were having their focal production be agriculture, whereas others were having ceramics or lithic raw materials or other products that they could trade. And so hopefully that was informative, and hopefully it was also exciting to see how these methods are coming together and how community members, both Pueblo and local residents, are interested in starting to use these methods for their own projects moving forward. So thank you so much to you all for your attention and time today. And thank you to all the folks who helped fund the project, who helped work on the project, who helped teach me how to do some of these analyses. And thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Kaitlyn. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I've lived in Arizona and always wondered, how did they grow their crops out here? I mean, this is high desert.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always been a mystery to me.
And hopefully it was a fun little detour to New Mexico too. I'm not sure if most of the other presentations are Arizona focused or not, but thank you for letting me transport you all to New Mexico for a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
You want to turn your share off?
What did they make the mulch out of?
Yeah, so the mulch was these quaternary gravel. So it was a really particular type of local gravel, and they would pick out really refined pieces of it and sort them. And so the pieces are, they'd be about an inch and in 1 to 2 inches. So it was quaternary gravels at a 1 to 2 inch level. And then that would be infilled with local sediments.
We did have one person ask what type of cotton were they growing?
That is a really great question, Carol. And the reason why I'm pausing is because I can say that for Hopi, there's a variety called Aboriginal Sacaton, and there are other varieties that are all within the species or the genus Gossypium. But for the pollen analyses that we were doing in New Mexico, our pollen grains and our pollen data, we couldn't get to a more specific type than just the genus Gossypium. So we couldn't tell from our data if it was the same varieties of cotton that were grown in Hopi or if it was a different variety. It'd be great if we found some samples where we could get to that information, but the limits of the techniques that we were working with is that we couldn't get to that level of specificity. Sorry.
Well, another question that I had is, were you able to measure the rainfall through the different time periods to see how the crops were growing and if anything has changed?
Yeah, so we the environmental model that we used runs off of, it's the PaleoCar model. So if any of you have read Tim Kohler's work or Kyle Basinski's work, how they use the model is they took climate data, which extends back from local weather stations where they have the temperature and the water monitors set up on the landscape. That runs back about 100 years. And then from there, we use the dendrochronology record of looking at wet years versus dry years in the tree ring dates. And we'll then basically we use an algorithm to extrapolate, okay, here's our climate data now in terms of our weather stations that say, oh, this many inches fell in these years. Here's the tree ring width of growing that year that corresponds to this inches of rainfall. So when we find that same kind of thickness of water retention in a tree in historical tree rings and archaeological tree rings, we then assume that those inches in our modern weather stations of rain correspond because the tree ring widths line up in terms of the trees uptaking that amount of water for that year. And so that's the how behind how that algorithm works. And then what it spits out for us is for each calendar year, it spits out how much rain was falling that year over that particular area. And so we do have, for the archaeological data, from about 800, 1,000-ish is when the data gets pretty reliable. Up until the modern day is what we have, and we do have a year estimate for each one. I know there's a long rambling back end to the how. As far as the specific numbers and how they compare to today, the inches of rainfall were a little bit wetter than what we see now, but not much. So it was yeah, we didn't see any huge like drought years versus wet years, at least in the time period we were focusing on. There were drier years, but not as drastic as the great drought of the late 1200s or anything like that.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, that your period is 1400 to 1600, which was after the great drought.
Yeah, so it was environmentally, it was not too shabby of a time. It wasn't a super thriving time, but it was manageable.
Well, do we have anybody else here in the audience or on Zoom would like to ask questions? Well, I think you answered most of our questions, and you talked about something that I've really had an interest in and haven't seen too many people talk about it. So with that, I'd want to thank you again for your time and your effort and your knowledge. And if nobody has any other questions, I'll go ahead and end the meeting.